when we talk about bad fruit, we have two groups of people tasting the fruit here of Gothard. People who have experienced actual trauma. You know what I mean? That's real. That happened with people. We can see it in the documentary. They can both tell you that it tastes bad and they spit it out. This is gross. We don't like this. This is bad fruit. But I think only one type of standard has the ability to tell you how the fruit became that way and why it's wrong that it's bad to begin with.
Progressive Christianity has already rejected the fundamental tenets of the faith. Like, they've already rejected the deity of Jesus, the Trinity, the basic fundamental doctrines. They totally reject any affirmation of gender. I mean, it's basically neo-paganism cosplaying as Christianity on Wish.com. That's what you're seeing.
All right, guys, I'm really excited to have my good friends Jerry and Andrew on my channel today to talk about Shiny Happy People. Is that the name of it? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Happy. I have it written down. Okay. So we're going to talk about this documentary, docuseries rather, and just kind of get our thoughts on it, what we thought about it. And if you guys are not familiar with the Coltish guys, you're missing out. This is not the first time that I've mentioned them. I've been on their podcast many times. I've talked about them many times on my channel. I'm a fan of Coltish. Guys, thanks for coming on and talking about this.
Yeah, super excited. We've had many adventures together, both on and offline. One of these days, we'll have to do a podcast just about what was happening on the cusp of the state of emergency in 2020. So you think about that, man. We have stories for days. So I mean, we've done lots of collaborations, and it's honestly really cool because not only, I mean, you've seen us grow and change from being, Andrew and I both being in studio to where now Andrew is helping, really being an elder candidate, helping pastor a church up in Utah. Yeah. I'm still here in Arizona. So you've seen us evolve. What I've really loved, I've just seen you really kind of grow your channel and just seeing the different topics that you cover. And it's been really cool to see your audience grow. And we both really have a passion for apologetics. And I think, I'm really excited to kind of unpack this. I'm really pumped.
Yeah, this is cool because, again, this is not our first rodeo. We've done a lot of projects and collabs together. And you contacted me and you're like, hey, let's do something, because every once in a while we just kind of have to.
Yep.
And I can't remember the first topic you brought up, but I remember being interested in this topic. I'm like, let's talk about this because a lot of people have brought it up. I'm very curious to watch it. All three of us, obviously, we like and enjoy learning about this kind of stuff, about cults and how they function and why they work. And so, yeah, I'm glad to talk about this with you guys. I just watched it this weekend. But before we get started, really quick, letting everybody know, you have your own YouTube channel now.
Finally, yes. We've been around for 5 years, which feels like forever ago. It feels like it's gone by really fast. Andrew, you can tell me how you feel, but it's gone by...
Man, Casey counted my hairs today, like my gray hairs. I actually have 6 or 7 of them, but before we started, I had 0.
Okay, so Andrew, you're officially getting a gray hair for every single year that Coltish has been around.
That's right.
Which basically, eventually, in year 20, you might look something like this beard right here. But yeah, it's we've been around for a while. We've got a pretty popular podcast that's a lot of people subscribe there. Usually our video versions have been on Apologia Studios YouTube channel. What we wanted to really do is just see if we can try and create, kind of like an online community there, and have a little bit more of a personal touch versus just viewership. So, thankfully we've had the leverage of the studio to kind of really promote our videos, but we are going to be putting some exclusive content on there and really creating a community there. So if you go to coltishtv.com, and you might even tag our Coltish channel in your YouTube. So if people want to actually connect with us on YouTube now, you can go to coltishtv.com. It'll redirect you. Or I think the domain right now is youtube.com/The Coltish Show, which is the same as our domain. You can go there, like, subscribe, all the buttons you push on the YouTube. So
on the YouTube, and I'll leave a description in the link. So, and probably pop it up there by Andrew's head.
For sure.
If you guys want to check it out and just click on it. And like I said, I'm a fan of the Coltish Show. I think that you guys cover a lot of topics that it's a niche topic. And that's how I got started in ministry, was with cults. So guys, be sure to check them out. But yeah, let's get started. Let's talk about this. I'm excited to see what you guys thought about Shiny Happy People. If you guys don't know what this is a docuseries that released on Amazon? Amazon Prime.
Yep.
And it's about the Duggar family. And it covers Gothardism and the IBLP, Institute for Basic Life Principles. Did I get that right?
Yep.
And which is like, it's a new cult to me. I didn't know anything about it until I read Ginger Volo's book, which, by the way, you guys interviewed Ginger Volo, Duggar Volo. Which way does it go? Does she hyphenate it Duggar Volo or Ginger Volo Duggar?
I don't know. It might have been.
No, this is the book right here, though. I just have this.
Oh, good.
Right there.
And so what is it? Is it Ginger Duggar Volo?
Ginger Duggar Volo.
Aha.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so she's, of course, a Duggar girl, wrote a book about her experience. Great book, by the way. Just before we even get started, I think it's very beneficial if you're a Christian to grab Ginger's book to understand the difference between Gothardism and Christianity and her journey of disentanglement. And it has a lot of people that were former IBLP, as well as Jill Duggar, who was the second oldest Duggar girl. And it's a 4-part series talking about Gothardism and things like that. And so we're just going to kind of talk about this from a Christian perspective. But first, I want to get your guys' thoughts on this. What were things that you liked about the docuseries?
Andrew, you want to start? You want to?
Yeah. So in terms of what I liked about the docuseries, because I just actually finished it on during the weekend as well.
Me too, yeah.
Was the basic information of what Gothardism was and what was occurring, and some of the information about what went wrong within the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Those are the things I think that they did a good job explaining. Relationships that Gothard had even with his brother, how he showed his brother favoritism when there was like scandals coming out that his brother was sexually abusing people. Instead of removing him from staff, he moves him to a place where it's even harder to get to his brother. And then further on, when more things keep happening, you got to watch just to get deep into it. Anyways, those are the things that they actually did good, I'd say, on the Amazon documentary. What about you? What do you think, Jerry?
Yeah, so I think in the sense of what the purpose of a documentary is, I think it's excellent. So some people will like, well, wait a minute. You think that Coltish might have some pushback against it. So a lot of times people will have a documentary they disagree with, and they'll say, oh, that's terrible. I can't stand the documentary. Here's my review and da-da-da. You get on my keyboard and stuff. Well, the purpose of a documentary, like a good person who does a documentary, the purpose is to get a conversation going, to get people to converse back and forth in the arena of ideas and to be a provocateur. So a good documentary will sort of rattle the cages and get people from both sides of the aisle, like where you can't ignore it, you have to talk about it. And this has happened before. If you think about in 2004, there was a documentary that came out, Michael Moore, Fahrenheit 9/11. Now, whether or not, my politics have definitely changed drastically since 2004. And I'm not going to get into that. But the reality is that that documentary, it was the most amount of money that was grossed from a theater, a documentary release ever. And everyone, both on the right and the left, had an opinion about it. And it was just the perfect timing, and it was well done, in that sense. Provocateur, creating a conversation. There's other documentaries too in a totally separate niche, like Food Inc. I'm not sure if you ever remember that. Yeah, so this is a documentary talking about food production, factory farming. It was one of the first, I remember this one, the very first documentary that really made me really think about, okay, well, what should I shop at the grocery store? Maybe there is something about ethically sourced food, where beforehand I was just like, oh, those are just what those hippies over in Hawaii care about. And then there's part of me, even as a Christian, was thinking wow, I should maybe really think more about what I support and how I vote with my dollars regarding food. So that was an example of a really well done documentary. And in this case, you're seeing the same thing. If you type in shiny happy people right now, I've already looked at it today. There's scores and scores of reviews, response videos, reaction videos. There's people who are in the documentary who have responded to, maybe they weren't happy about how they were portrayed, and then you have response videos to them. So in that sense, this is a great documentary because it's allowing for conversations to happen. So I'm thankful that it's come out, because it allows us to have a platform to then let's take a look and tangibly pick apart what it talked about. So in that sense, I would say it's good.
Yeah, I agree too. I was expecting it to be worse and harsh or something like that. The first 3 episodes, I honestly, you know what it reminded me of was, I can't remember what documentary or docuseries came out a few years ago about the Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was about, the misconduct and allegations that were going on in the organization. And I was like, hearty amen. I was on board with that. If it can be destroyed by the truth, it should be destroyed by the truth, right?
Right.
So that's kind of how I see these sorts of things. And there was a lots in this documentary or docuseries that I enjoyed and learned from and agreed with. I was surprised about that. I was like, yeah, this is good. Like, people need to talk about, high control religious groups, cults, which brings me to my next question. So I would like to know, okay, this is kind of what a lot of people would do that are just ardent anti-religious people. They kind of look at all religion like it's a cult.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people came from cults. And there's this broad brush that can be painted on certain beliefs that are, are seen through the eyes of trauma, right? So before we even get started, I think it would be helpful to ask the cultish guys who do this, full time, what is a cult? What actually would define something as a cult, and why is Gothardism, IBLP, considered a cult compared to other free religions?
Yeah.
Well, good question. Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, Jerry, go with it. You have a really good definition when you start talking about what a cult is and stuff.
Yeah, so usually the model that we adhere to, I mean, there's a couple of models that we would kind of go by. It's just a general parameter. One would be really the late Dr. Walter Martin in Kingdom of the Cults. He really would talk about a group polarized around either a central person or organization's interpretation of the Bible, while they will appeal to the fundamental tenets of Christianity. They will, usually will deny the essentials of the faith, namely that Jesus Christ is God in human form. So that's the really fundamental tenet. Then you also have the bite model of Steve Hassan, which I've actually just been reading through his book Freedom of Mind, where he's just, it's really an excellent kind of talking about the type of interventions of how to deal if you have a family member that's stuck in a cult. Really well done.
Yeah.
And, while Steve Hassan is not a Christian, he does not profess Christ. He is made the image of God, and everything that he appeals to in the bite model is something I thoroughly believe you can only give a true accounting from if you embrace the bite model from a behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control from a biblical worldview. Because if you abandon that, then the question is, by what standard? And I think what you end up seeing is that while Bill Gothard affirmed the essentials of the Christian faith, from my knowledge, it's been eons and eons. Like I said, I went to, now I'll talk about it. I had some involvement in Bill Gothard as a younger person.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah. But he affirmed, to the best of my knowledge, the fundamental, the tenets of the Christian faith. Like, he affirmed the deity of Jesus. He affirmed the Trinity. I think what happened is that you started to sort of see an embracement of the bite model of authoritarian control, of behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. And ultimately, it's something that really happens today. Affirmative parenting, how you say, like, I'm learning all this stuff. I'm newly married with a child on the way. So I'm kind of drinking from the fire hose. But what I've learned is that you have a broad variety, for example, even parents today who think, well, you need to raise your kids exactly this way. And it's not just a way, it becomes the way. And when a way becomes the way, it becomes the wrong way. Does that make sense?
So what do you think would say, so if a skeptic were hearing that and they're like, yeah, but you say Jesus is the way, what's the difference?
With Jesus is the way?
Yeah. So, like, just playing skeptical, I'm just kind of, being devil's advocate. But, like, if somebody were to hear that and they're like, yeah, but we say that Jesus is the way. We say, you know what I mean? Like, we have the same kind of, that's why it's confusing for some people.
Yeah. Well, anyone who deals with skeptics from, an agnostic or just a non-Christian point of view, or say they're an atheist and they're asking a question, well, why that? Well, what's the alternative? If you take an extreme example with Jim Jones and you look at what happened in Guyana, well, if all we are just bags of protoplasm where blind, pitiless indifference, as Richard Dawkins would say, then what's the ethical like outrage behind what happened with 900 people being forced to commit suicide or drink the Kool-Aid? And so the question is ultimately would come down to, like, by what standard? And like so in other words, like, as Walter Martin would really say, the existence of a counterfeit predicates the authenticity of an original. And so, and this is maybe what we'll try and unpack, which I think is important in this documentary, is that you see the alternative. You saw what you see in Bill Gothard, and a lot of what he talked about and advocated was a counterfeit. And so the existence of that counterfeit predicates an authenticity. So Bill Gothard talked about authority, right? Authority is not a bad thing. There's good authority and there's an abusive authority.
Yeah.
Just because, and it's not just Bill Gothard, just because there's men out there who abuse women, which is terrible and despicable, that doesn't mean that men should stand up and, like, protect women. If you see someone across the street being assaulted, if you are passive and just don't want to get away and just ignore it because you don't want to get involved, and that's something that's wrong and that's evil. So there's levels in which, just because there's bad people who do things, or there's an abuse of something, doesn't mean there's a counterpoint of a good version of that. And I think rather than try and dismantle and deconstruct, I think what Ginger has done, which maybe we'll unpack too, is rather than deconstruct, she really coined that phrase. I really feel like she coined the phrase disentangle.
Yeah.
I feel like that because you see deconstruction everywhere. Like, I'm 42 years old, and I know so many people who have gone that route, who have deconstructed. Like, I have my own past. Like, when I hear the stories in that documentary of those people, like, you if you watch the documentary, you know them. And I've seen so many documentaries like that where you see the real hurt and the real pain, right? And the question is, like, well, how do you answer them? Like, these are real issues. These are real people who have been affected by false teaching. And as Andrew has that hat he's wearing, bad theology hurts people.
I'm wearing the same shirt.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Nice. Got to pop that. Shopcoltish.com.
Got to represent.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jerry, can I take a stab at this Gothardism? All right. So.
I'm excited to hear what Andrew has to say too. Yeah.
So when we think about what Gothard was telling people, is he was telling people something that was very biblical, right? He's saying to them that we have these umbrellas, and we have God at the top, husband, wife, children. Okay, and it stacks down from there. But the issue of what Gothard was doing is he wasn't telling them the invisible umbrella between God and husband, or God and husband and wife, and that was him. Okay, so he's taking and filtering the word of God through himself and creating basic life principles, right? That, as Jerry said, is what is a way, and teaching them as the way. Okay, so the Bible warns us in Colossians chapter 2 that we're not supposed to be fooled by human traditions, right? Or principles and ordinances of men. And that's exactly what happened with Gothardism. He created principles of men that were not the gospel, in terms of how to act, how to think, how to dress. And I think what the documentary showed for me when I was watching it was a bigger issue within modern America was the fact that the local churches for these individuals that fell to Gothardism had failed them. It had failed them. And that's what Gothardism did. It was like a web that went through all of these people through local churches, because we got to remember, they weren't just being submissive to Gothard, but they're supposed to be in a local church body as well, with a pastor who's supposed to be a shepherd of the flock, right? But allowing Gothard's teachings to actually poison part of the well. Does that make sense? I think the documentary shows that in such a way. But the gospel, Paul declares all throughout the New Testament, is that it's not from man. It is the gospel of God, because it's freedom. It saves your soul, and it makes you want to obey God's statutes through a regenerated heart, not just through external obedience and outward expressions of that obedience to everybody else. So he took principles that were true, that you can extrapolate from the Bible, but he then twisted them, and they were manipulated through one central individual, which is Gothard, and this is why it's very culty, right? And he filtered that, and he weaved that into the local churches of America during that time with poisoning the well. And we can see the fruit of that, because the Bible also warns us about the fruit of false teaching is exactly what we saw occur in the documentary, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
and this is why I like the documentary in general,
yeah,
in that regard, because I think it does a good job of exposing this kind of stuff. I do. This is why I wanted to ask you guys about cults, because I wish that they had that opportunity, 2 minutes, 1 minute,
yeah,
to take the time to talk about what is a cult. And
yeah,
I
Yeah.
appreciate, at least in the first episode, there was a woman who briefly said, "This isn't Christianity. This is like a cult." You
right,
Yeah.
know, like there was a differentiation between the two, and I appreciated that because because what we believe, and it was stunning how much it reminded me of Jehovah's Witnesses.
mm,
Just throughout this entire docu-series, I'm like, wow, that's
Yeah.
like Jehovah's Witnesses. Wow, that's like Jehovah's Witnesses. Wow, that's just like the J-Dubs. Throughout the whole thing, I'm like, this. Even the former IBLP people that they interviewed sounded exactly like former Jehovah's Witnesses. And
Yeah.
so that was that. But I do wish that they did due diligence as, hey, this is a cult. This is what makes a cult.
Yeah.
Things
right.
like that. But no, that was good how you guys broke that down. What else did you want to add?
Yeah, think about it this way. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like when we talk about bad fruit, we have two groups
Mhm.
of people tasting the fruit here of Gothard. One, people who have experienced actual trauma, you know what I mean? That's real, that happened with people. We can see it in the documentary. But we have also people that come from a biblical worldview who still submit to what the Bible says as the sole authority,
Yeah.
infallible rule of faith and practice, whereas some people don't. So we have two people taking a bite of Gothard's fruit, right? They can both tell you that it tastes bad, and they spit it out. This is gross. We don't like this. This is bad fruit. But I think only one type of standard has the ability to tell you how the fruit became that way and why it's wrong that it's bad to begin with. Does that make sense? So we
Yeah.
can see in the documentary that we have people who are now, let's say, quote unquote, secular, tasting of the fruit, but what they accidentally do is they broad brush an entire group of Christianity and lump them in there with Gothardism because they don't like what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really easy to do. And we see that again from people that have been traumatized by cults. And you know what, let me just say, I always said this with Jehovah's Witnesses, like what a tricky thing to do. Like if you're the devil, what are you going to, I mean, you know what I mean? You're going to create this man-made religion in the name of God with all these Christianese terms, and you're going to put disdain on it. You're going to stain it. You're going to make it a bitter taste. And then you're going to make those people that were in there associate everything about God and Christianity and the Bible with this false version that they had. You know what? It reminds me of somebody who's been abused in a marriage. You know what I mean? They're in a bad relationship. They're in a toxic marriage, and they get out and they feel free. And you know what they say? I'm never going to get married again. Marriage is terrible. Marriage
Yeah.
is awful. It's the worst thing in the world. I'm just going to get hurt. And it's through eyes of trauma, forgetting that there's an actual oughtness, if you will, to what marriage is supposed to be. That's kind of what it reminds me of when I
Yeah.
look at cults in Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think what you also really see, and I think Ginger also talked about this in her book,
Mhm.
and you'll really see this starting, you see a principle of pendulum swings
Mhm.
where there's always a reaction and then there's an overreaction. So what you end up really seeing is Bill Gothard's movement was a reaction to the 1970s and the sexual revolution
Yep.
and really the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, if you even think previously to that, you look at like Woodstock, for example, and the footage, everyone knows the infamous Woodstock footage of people, like hippies in the mud with Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and Jim Morrison. Well, every single one of those young people at some point like had parents. They were part of households. So where were the parents? Like where was the discipleship? Where was sort of that instruction of being growing up in the admonition of the Lord to say, hey, well, maybe this is, enough to where like just telling, hey, you shouldn't do that. Well, enough to say, well, kids who are around that time would think, well, maybe I don't know if this is something I should be really partaking of. Well, you didn't see that. People just delved head into it. And so what you see is the Bill Gothard movement is a reaction to that. It's an overreaction. And so
Yeah.
you had, for example, rock and roll was sort of associated with kids rebelling. And so a big part of Bill Gothard's curriculum was that, rock and roll was inherently evil, not just about whether or not, you had different musicians, for example, who might have been connected with Aleister Crowley. Like Bill Gothard went as far to say that literally the syncopated rhythm within like rock music, the riff of a guitar might invoke demons in you. Like I was in maybe 12 or 13 years old when I was at my first Bill Gothard seminar, and I actually had a Walkman because my parents were kind of strict. They were trying to do what they could to be protective of me. I had a Walkman, which I was listening to Van Halen. I had an affinity for Van Halen, and I was listening to Panama from Van Halen on the way to the Bill Gothard conference.
Sinner.
Yes, I know. In the conference, Bill Gothard has a segment where he talks about rock and roll. I was scared out of my mind.
Yeah.
Like I was terrified. I wouldn't even I didn't listen to music for like 4 weeks. I was terrified to even listen to any music. Like I think I started listening a little bit to classical music.
Mm-hmm.
Then I might have listened to a movie soundtrack or something like that. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna turn on the radio and just see what happens. And I worked my way back in. But the point is that it was an overreaction. And so you really have the sexual revolution where people are now promiscuous. You have the infamous like women burning their bras and all the radical feminism of the 1970s. Well, what do we do in reaction to that? Every woman needs to have their hair cut the exact same way and have their skirts to this specific length. And literally it was an aspect of like, don't think about pink elephants, where you had an overreaction to where as much as women were dressed provocatively in that sort of like very promiscuous Janis Joplin-esque aesthetic, now you had it to where it's like you need to dress a specific way because men are full of raging hormones. They can't control themselves. And if they see any part of skin besides like your hands or whatever it was, then it's going to be your fault if somehow they stumble. And so then you have this overreaction where now it's like, don't think about pink elephants, where literally everything that you wear, everything that you do might be something that might make someone lust.
Yeah.
So you have a culture where the very thing that because you're trying to do it by way of like human achievement and through like legalism and oppressivism, the very thing that you're trying to squelch, you're creating a monster.
Yes. And I thought that it would be very interesting to get your guys' thoughts on this, but legalism creates deconstruction and legalism creates victims. Okay. Like the amount of abuse, it makes me angry. Like even as a female, it should make anybody angry, no matter what gender they are. And about how many of these women were abused and in general, like the spiritual abuse, the physical abuse. I have a friend, T.C. Cannon, and then a mutual friend of ours, my friend Naomi Wright. They have a ministry that they work together with that helps people from legalistic religions, spiritual abuse. I will leave a link to their ministry, by the way, in the description for everybody to check out. But this is what they do, is they catch people who have fallen out of these very legalistic and abusive environments. But the key here is the spiritual abuse as well, because people end up having a caricature of Jesus in the gospel. And every time they look at Jesus in any way in a mental image, it's like a slap in the face for them. I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that. What would you say to somebody who's watching who maybe doesn't agree with us, right? Like maybe they think that we're just lumped into this whole thing. What is something you want to say to them, and something that you want to share maybe about legalism and the cult-like mentality that it creates?
Yeah, I would say that legalism is a gospel that is not from God. It is a gospel of man and a gospel that cannot save. Jesus Christ was God in the flesh, and he was perfectly obedient to the law. He died on the cross, the death that I deserve, and rose from the dead, conquering sin in the grave. And it's through his perfect work on the cross that I inherit his righteousness, meaning that there's nothing that I can do out of my own accord to earn salvation. So there's no legalistic principle from man that makes it to when I die and I stand before God the Father, that I actually have a bone to pick with him through my own personal righteousness. The Bible declares emphatically that all of my own personal works are nothing but filthy rags before God. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 2, it says that all of my good works were prepared beforehand for me to walk in them through Jesus Christ. And it's only in Jesus Christ that I can perform any type of good work. That's why when I die and I go to heaven, my crown is casted off my head. It's at the feet of Jesus. Legalism is condemned by the Bible.
Mhm.
Through and through. Go read the book of Galatians when Paul is speaking to the Judaizers who are Jews that came to faith, right? Quote unquote. They were speaking to Gentile believers and they were telling them, hey, you guys must first become circumcised in order to become a Christian. And Paul goes and he condemns them. And he goes as far to say that you might as well just cut your whole member off your body if that's what you think. Legalism does not save anyone. It says in Galatians chapter 3 that if you seek to be justified by the works of the law, the death of Christ or the grace of Christ has no effect on you because you're looking towards something different other than Jesus, meaning this, that it's a different gospel. So if you're listening to what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is if you look at me and you hear what I'm saying and go, well, you say Jesus, so I'm going to picture the Jesus that I was taught that was wrong. Well, guess what? That was never Jesus to begin with. It was a different Jesus and it was a different gospel. That's the truth. So you need to realize or try to like wrestle with the fact that now, what if the Jesus you were told about wasn't the actual Jesus? Okay. So if your opinion of Jesus isn't based on truth, then maybe your feelings towards him also aren't true as well. So
like the abusive marriage. And you heard it here, folks.
Yeah.
Not one thing about you have to wear pants to please God, or you have to wear a skirt to please God, and pants are demonic. And like these man-made rules and religions, it's separate from the simplicity of the gospel.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Man, I think this is an area that I've seen a lot of reviews and friends on Facebook who would post or tweet about this, and they would very much they'd jump right away and just say that, hey, this is attacking conservative Christians with a sweeping broad generalization, utilizing what happened with the Duggars and Bill Gothard and all that. And we'll talk about that. I mean, that's definitely part of the conversation, but I think there's areas sometimes in which you can't. So there's a guy named Jocko Willink. He's a ex-Navy SEAL. He was a leader of SEAL Team 6. He's got this amazing TED Talk called Extreme Ownership. And the guy is like an intimidating figure. He looks like a hybrid between The Rock and like an angry Matt Damon. And he has this TED Talk where he basically talks about this operation. Andrew's cracking up here, where he had a military operation where things went wrong. There were some people who were killed, and he realized that ultimately, he was the head of command. He had to give an account for like what happened, and he realized that the buck stopped with him. He had to take ownership, like even though it hurt his ego and he hurt his pride and all that. So as much as this documentary, we want to get defensive, we want to go after certain parts of the documentary, which we'll definitely talk about. I think there's something in which we have to own where we have failed, we have dropped the ball, like as a church, in dealing with abuse. There's so many times where even like the corporation, where the church, when you have a call like corporate Christianity, where the church is really a corporation, really about supply and demand and creating the perfect persona, where you can't allow for, you're all about protecting the brand. The brand's more important than
the
people.
image.
We've all had, Melissa, we've all had to wrestle with this. Like I remember you doing the tribute to Ravi Zacharias and doing the painting. Like I remember, our friend and brother Mike Winger, when he was having to kind of go through, the allegations of the abuse that Ravi went through. And it was amazing. I mean, everyone knows Mike Winger, just the Bible thinker guy. I think in that, if you remember that podcast or the YouTube where Mike was talking about Ravi, I saw like the pastor Mike, and I know that because I've been there, like alongside, my pastor, like looking at people who've been abused and have been through like SRA and those sorts of things. And like, it's like you're looking at someone who's like been to and from like the Eye of Mordor, like staring into the face of evil. And they're asking like, where was God in all this?
Yeah.
And like, as a Christian, like we have to answer, for that. And we can't like make excuses. We have to say, you know what, we've dropped the ball here. And in many cases, ultimately a lot of these people have deconstructed. And in some sense, like in Romans, this might be a little harsh, but it says, like, as is written, the name of the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So a lot of the deconstruction is really like some of our own fruit of not dealing appropriately with abuse. So I think there's a couple of things we could hopefully learn from this. Is one of the things that is a way a church should be run, or really not just a church should be run, well, it should be run, is really understanding, for example, the different spheres of government. You have personal government, you have self-government, you have family government, you have church government, and you have civil government. There's certain things that belong in those spheres. So, for example, if Andrew and Pastor Wade are counseling a couple, say it's marriage reconciliation, something to do with just a marriage conflict, right? That's in the jurisdiction of the church. Hey, let's figure out what's going on. Let's bring it in. Let's talk through it. Let's work through it. But in the moment, if in that counseling it comes to wake that there's some sort of abuse going on, say there's child abuse, or there's some sort of sexual abuse going on, or domestic abuse that's confirmed and verified, right? Independent lines of testimony and witness. At that point, Andrew and Wade, or the pastors, they can still preach the gospel to them, still be a minister to them, and say you need to repent and reconcile and those sorts of things. But now you have verifiable evidence that a crime has been committed. In that moment, it's the responsibility of that church or clergy person. They need to contact the authorities because it's out of their jurisdiction. And many churches, did you see the recent Hillsong documentary?
No, actually,
okay.
I've been wanting
to watch it. Right. So you see kind of the same thing happen there too, where basically you have a crime that's committed. Right. I never watched the Duggar documentary. I don't know all the intricacies of what happened with Josh Duggar, all those sorts of things. But at least from what's articulated in the documentary, they confirmed that this crimes were committed, even though it is within the family. From what it seemed like, if what the documentary depicted is true, that it was done, if they tried to just sort of handle it as a family affair, or let's not think of civil authorities involved. Let's get them to some sort of one of Gothard's youth programs. That's an abuse of power. That's an abuse of power. You did not get the civil authorities to go in. And that's dangerous, because what happens is that when you don't get the civil government involved, when you don't call the authorities in the case where abuse happens, then you create a willful prejudice, because now self-preservation is the only reason why you wouldn't get the civil authorities involved is because of self-preservation.
Yeah.
And when that happens, the interest becomes the self-preservation of the church, not the victims of the abused.
Yeah.
And so I think there's many different ways in which the church needs to reform and needs to deal with advocating, protecting for the victims of the abuse. And so I think before we even do any of that, the abuse is real. The way the church in many ways has handled it has failed. There needs to be serious reformation regarding that. So it's not just cults. It's not just the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses who've gotten themselves in trouble with their 2 witnesses policy. Regular churches do this happen all the time. If you remember the pastor C.J. Mahaney with Sovereign Grace Church, same thing happened with them. There were cases of abuse. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they handled it as internally as a church. They didn't get the authorities involved, and they got in trouble because of that. So it's something. This is an area where the church has to own it. And now, in some sense, when you're seeing the people who are these victims of abuse, and it just breaks my heart, is we have to own, in some sense, this is the bed that we've made. And in some sense, watching this documentary is us having to sort of lay in it.
Yeah, so I think that there's also a good thing to kind of point out the differentiation here too, because a lot of this does happen within cults. But yeah, you're right. Like within well-known ministries, it does go on. It's not to say that there's probably a lot of times where it doesn't go reported when it was handled correctly. What I mean? But yeah, so pray for pastors. If you see something, you're not hurting it. You are in the sense of justice, not acting within the image of God. You're not protecting a fellow image bearer. Whenever you're not speaking up. So, Andrew, did you have anything you want to add, or did you want to transition to something else that of interest to you in this?
Yeah, I just want to add that when Jerry's talking about what ought to be done in terms of trauma or sexual abuse or the spheres of government. These are not just things that he's saying out of his own opinion ought to be done. These are actually biblical principles and standards that we have. It says, according to the Bible,
moral law.
Moral law and civil, in terms of how the civil government has their own authority, is dictated in the Bible as well. Romans 13 talks about the state punishes those who does evil, praises those who does good, that the church bears the rod and the state bears the sword for punishment. Therefore, the civil jurisdiction, in terms of when an actual crime is committed, the church needs to tell the local authorities what is going on so the actual proper things can take place. And so what Jerry's explaining, I just want to echo it a little bit, is that when these failures happen within the local church, within, let's say, the context of the United States of America, it's when they're not following actually what the Bible dictates. And that's why we have to lay in the bed that we made.
Yeah. So yeah, this documentary was pretty heavy hitting with the abuse within Gothardism and the teachings of Gothardism. So in that regard, I think it's actually good for people to watch so that they understand what this religion is. And people that know the Bible, they're going to know immediately, of course, like, oh, that's a cult. Like there's a difference between what is here on this standard and what's over here. So that's important to point out. So we talked about things that we agree with and things that things about the documentary. There was a lot of hidden abuse, things within the Duggar family, but also within Bill Gothard himself. And all these things came to light because that's usually how it works with truth. What are some things that you guys saw that maybe you were like, I don't know about that. I don't agree with that. For me in particular, it was episode 4 when I started thinking like, oh, okay, I think I have some disagreements with this about, maybe, homeschool, kind of like maybe an overreach with what homeschool is, because I homeschool, and I teach critical thinking. I want the girls to understand, my girls to understand certain things about how to think and what to think, and about other things within the realm of government, Christianity in general, Christian influencers, things like that. What did you guys think on that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I'm falling in the same boat. I homeschool my children. Actually, that's one of the big ones. There was a broad brush painted as in like almost every single homeschooler is this type of Gothardite type of person. That's just not accurate whatsoever. In reality, it's just something to say to have that emotional pull. I like what Jerry said earlier, though. It does get a conversation started, but in the way it was portrayed in episode 4 was like the Christians and evangelical culture at large is the problem of what's going on in America today, and that we indoctrinate our children, but they don't indoctrinate their children, that they're totally neutral in terms of the way that the public school raises children. So that bothered me a little bit. And there was a double standard I saw at play as well, because they talked about trauma and children, how children shouldn't be abused this way or children should be abused that way. But at the end of episode 4, it was also painting the light that the overturning of Roe versus Wade was a bad thing. I thought we were talking about the abuse of children here. I believe that abortion is like I think it's around 60 million babies have been surgically aborted, murdered from their mother's wombs, torn apart. Even their own sexual organs ripped off of their bodies from inside their mother's wombs and pulled out and taken on a tray and counted to make sure all of it was taken. You know what I mean? Like there's a double standard at play when they talk about the abuses within Christianity, and that it's a bad thing that Roe versus Wade is overturned, but we're turning a blind eye to one of the most biggest modern forms of abuse in America, which is the murdering of children. That bothered me actually quite a bit. But you can see in that there's a worldview behind just the people who are making the documentary in general. Freedom through legalism. They're legalists as well, but they don't think that they sacrifice themselves for freedom. They sacrifice their own children for freedom. So I don't know. There's a little bit of those things that bothered me in episode 4.
Turned political for sure.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's very similar to a lot of the other documentaries and series from a secular point of view. Like if you're trying to minister to somebody who's if you're trying to engage with cults from a non-Christian perspective, the ultimate place you sort of send people is into some sort of nihilism or atheism or agnosticism, and just saying, hey, well, you're now free to think on your own, and like as G.K. Chesterton would say, that an open mind is no different than an open mouth. Like eventually it has to bite down on something. Again, talking about earlier, you have the pendulum swinging. You could tell a lot of the people in this documentary have pendulum swung and have become a lot more progressive. So in some sense, they've tried to become progressive to differentiate themselves from their parents and from their upbringing, but they're still the exact same thing. If you think about progressivism and wokeism and this whole movement that's completely interconnected with, all the different gender and pronouns ideology, is there any movement right now more legalistic? I mean, you say the wrong names, you say the wrong pronouns, you are canceled, you are done, you are losing your job, you are losing your livelihood if you do not affirm to this specific doctrine or creed. So on one end of the spectrum, you say, oh, well, okay, I'm a byproduct of purity culture. So I grew up in a household where I had to wear a long dress. Therefore, I'm going to pendulum swing to the other side and allow my children to pick their own gender. And if they need to, mutilate their own genitals, because they can go ahead and just be whatever they want to be. And then what you're going to see is 20 years from now, like, I don't even want to, like, the amount of people who are now going to pendulum swing to the other side, or are going to be swinging to, what's going to be the after effect of the pendulum swing from radical progressivism? We've already seen how far it's gotten, where you have this progressive Christianity has already rejected the fundamental tenets of the faith. Like, they've already rejected the deity of Jesus, the Trinity, the basic fundamental doctrines. They totally reject any affirmation of gender. I mean, it's basically neo-paganism cosplaying as Christianity on Wish.com. Like, that's what you're seeing. And so now you're having this overreaction. So in one sense, I get the fact of the abuse. And as a Christian, I can make sense of the abuse, because everything that happened in the Gothard movement was an abuse of biblical standards. And even, like I said, I mean, we can have the whole conversation of, complementarianism, egalitarianism, that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm more on, like, the complementarian side of things, but even, like, there's a level of, like, patriarchy, or, like, where it really just means, like, father rule. And in a sense, there is an abuse of father rule, not sins of commission with Gothard, but also sins of omission of fathers who were not shepherds of their children. Okay, why on earth would you ever take advice from anyone on how to do a marriage, on how to run a marriage, how to raise a family, and raise your children from someone who is never married and never had kids? Is there any other thing that you would ever do? Would you ever take cooking lessons? Would you ever learn lessons on how to run a restaurant from somebody whose only experience is pouring themselves cold cereal in the morning? Or, like, you do that, or like mechanics. Like, that's the level of it. So not only would you had fathers who didn't do that, and this is what's also interesting, is that, so even though I grew around the Bill Gothard movement, and I wasn't like Gothardites, like, I had families in close proximity to me that were, like, they were Bill Gothard, like, just frontwards, leftwards, back and right. Like, that's the reality. And, like, my dad actually is, and my dad was not perfect. There's areas in which he was great as a father, there's areas in which he definitely failed. But honestly, the reason why Bill Gothard's teachings ultimately did not go into my family was because of my father's patriarchal authority. He saw that there were inconsistencies with Bill Gothard's teaching, and in fact, there's books that my mom brought into our house that had Bill Gothard. My dad actually went through them and said, no, we can't have these in here, and he threw them out. So deconstruction and progressivism would say, destroy everything, destroy any level of patriarchy, authority, or father rule. Like, part of what helped protect me from Gothard's teachings was my own father's wisdom and intuition. And so just because there's a counterfeit, with Bill Gothard, a counterfeit patriarch, and in some sense, patriarchs who decided to take advice from somebody who had never walked a mile in their shoes. I mean, it just, like I said, it just seems like common sense. You should have some experience, So yeah, I think there's levels in which, the documentary does bring up real abuses, but ultimately, you ask by what standard. And you end up seeing when they try and be moral arbiters, I'm not saying, well, you are you're promoting just progressive legalism. Like, you have no standard, like, and nothing. Like, one area I'll just say real quickly is that they talked about how they were had educational neglect, right? I think someone in there talks about how they didn't have the proper education, and the documentary edits over this one clip of the Duggars at the Creation Museum. So what that does, it implies that any Christian with any sort of worldview, that of any level, that embraces creationism, now we're somehow like a defect. We're some sort of defect intellectually. Like, that's just that somehow we are educationally neglected. Any Christian who embraces that model is not. That's like not the case. But honestly, like, my position is like, I listened to the Joe Rogan Experience. I listened to like Neil deGrasse Tyson and other people who have views or who deal from an evolutionary point of view, and I have to think critically. I mean, I know good friends and brothers who hold to theistic evolution. I've had to kind of like wrestle through, okay, well, why do they believe that, and why don't I disagree? Like, you have to like think through critically, and to sort of say that because you hold on to this sort of Christian dogma that somehow you are oppressed and you're held back from believing real science. Like, real science, like, you don't even know, you can't even figure out what a biological male or woman is, and you want to lecture me about science? Like, get out.
We need a mic drop, bro. That was like 10 minutes of just mic dropping, bro. You had me with the Wish one, dude. That was so awesome.
That was funny. Yeah. That was a good rant.
Yeah.
And kind of a sermonette, so to speak, with some things. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. And, the thing is that at least in the last episode, there was elements of almost like far right extremism that they associated with Christianity. And I thought that was strange. Because, I mean, there is a political overlap with Gothardism and politics. I get it. And I don't deny that as on some level as people, especially with like Christian nationalism, which might be a whole other conversation. I don't agree with that. I think that's dangerous, right? I think that there's elements there that are not good or healthy. And I don't know. It's like there's so many levels of Christians that just don't agree with that at all, but those aren't the ones they're seeking out to interview for this documentary. I thought that was really strange. And even if they did, there was like this, like you said, like an anti-intellectual, they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, especially with the Christian influencers. They just kind of showed, Christians online that talk about Christian life. And I'm like, well, couldn't you got William Lane Craig? Couldn't you have gotten Mike Winger? Yeah. You know what I mean? Why not reach out to like a theologian? Reach out to maybe an apologist. I mean, I think it's interesting that they went on that level to kind of broad brush Christianity, and then the connection was made. Well, those are IBLP principles, and you just don't realize it.
Right.
One of the former IBLPs said, and I couldn't understand how he could make that association when there was an actual proper way to look at a biblical teaching compared to the lens of trauma that they went through with Gothardism. I thought that was interesting. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that got me too. I remember when you said that, and I was like, well, no, it's not. It's actually a biblical thing, buddy. That has nothing to do with Goddardism. But I mean,
and it reminded me again of Jehovah's Witnesses. Even going to the Bethel and not that Bethel. Everybody's thinking one thing. It's different. With Jehovah's Witnesses, they have a Bethel organization, and then with Gothard, he had his I forget what they call it, but it was like their Bethel, like the place that you went to go headquarters. You went to headquarters.
Yeah.
And you got to be with Bill Gothard, and it was just like this wow thing. So many similarities with Jehovah's Witnesses. It was interesting. Keep going with what you were saying, though. I was listening.
It shows you that young man is living his life through the lens of his personal experience and trauma. So to him, that's what he went through, and that's what he doesn't like. So anything that resembles that is just what it is to him. Right. So he makes a statement stating that's Gothardism. Well, obviously, if you make a statement like that, you really haven't taken the time to do research biblically to see if it's actually something that the Bible is teaching or what the correct way would be. Instead, he identifies it with his feelings, and he says that that's just Gothardism. Wake up, guys. It's like, I hold to that. I didn't even know who Bill Gothard was or Gothardism. For the longest time, like I did watch actually like 14 Kids and Counting and stuff like that growing up. I just thought they were different Christians than I was. It wasn't really until the last like 5 or 6 months where this conversation has really been taking a hold, where I've kind of learned more about Bill Gothard, but I had no influence on him in my life, but I believed the things that these Christian influencers were saying, in terms of gender or submission in the family. It says it in Ephesians chapter 5. It says it in Colossians chapter 3. It says it in 1 Peter. It says it in so many areas. Wives, submit to your husbands as it is fitting in the Lord. But then it also says, husbands, love your wives. There's two different things at play here, and they both matter a lot, because if a husband's not loving his wife and he's abusing her to get her to submit to things that aren't biblical, then we have a problem here. Right. So it's just, we're not seeing a whole story or scope of what the Bible actually taught within the documentary. We're just seeing a fear-based episode in number 4. Like, these Christians have arrows, and these arrows are going to go into the government, and they're going to take away our abortion. They're going to take away our sexuality, and they're going to take away all of these things. That's what I saw essentially in the last episode. And it was almost laughable. Really, it was a little bit of fear there. And I was like, well, you know what? I hope more Christians do get involved in the government and speak biblical truth, because the word of God never returns void, and it also restrains the evil hearts of men. And I would like to see change happen in this nation. I would like to see national repentance. Absolutely. I'm a Christian, man. I want to see people come to Christ. I was like, yeah, let's go. That sounds so.
Yeah, but they make it sound like we're trying to take over the world with, these, far right extreme views. And I did not get that connection, other than how it got there was how you explain. It's just, there's this obvious bias. And, people say that they're a Christian now, and all of a sudden it's really strange how they broad brush you and assume things about what you believe because of the abuses. And that's how they associate Christians, is the abuses in high control groups, religious groups, which is not fair in my opinion. Jerry, what were you going to say?
So in the documentary, they had the sort of it looked like the men's sort of like military boot camp, like the young men's where they all dressed in uniforms, were on the bus and stuff like that. I almost went to one of those. Yeah, you see your eyes. Yeah. So
almost.
Yeah. So I like I said, when I was younger, I went to the Bill Gothard seminar, and I remember just walking away from it. And it left a weird taste in my mouth. I mean, obviously the rock and roll story, but some of it's kind of silly. But I really struggled a lot of times as a young kid of always wanting to fit in. And one of the things that was challenging for me is that, my parents were always really strict as far as how we could dress, and it's very similar to Gothardism, which maybe is why that attracted them in the first place. So all my friends were able to wear casual clothes to Sunday. And so I would sort of come in the church kind of dressed like a odd duck a little bit, because I had to dress up and everything. And so I just saw Gothardism. I kind of had a sort of a weird feeling about it, after the conference. And so I remember we had a family who we were in close proximity to, a large family, 10 plus kids. And they were into HCI everything. And two of their boys were in one of their, this boot camp or whatever it was. And they had actually approached my parents. They had approached my parents about getting me to be in it. And right away, as soon as that happened, my parents were like, hey, you're going to go to this Bill Gothard boot camp thing. I was like, oh no, I need to figure out some way to say, no, this is not the case. And so I was kind of new. I was a new Christian. I was into doing, understanding the world of cults and reading Walter Martin. And so I was like, I need to figure out something that's just off. And so I started just researching some of Bill Gothard's theology. And honestly, this is the early, AOL days of the internet. And I actually started Googling Bill Gothard cult. And believe it or not, and this is in the late 90s, I actually found websites and Reddit threads of people who had really, really bad experiences of young men. And they're like, this is not the case. This is really strange. This isn't Christian. And so it was one of the few times, and I think actually that this conversation I had with my dad, and, my dad sometimes was a little overarching in his authority, my way or the highway. But it was one of the few times where I just stood up to my dad and said, no, I don't care. You can ground me. I'm not going. And here's why. And I showed him, and we had a conversation back and forth. And in fact, that conversation I had with my dad was the catalyst for my dad to actually listen to what I had to say, which led to Gothard's books being thrown out of that. So it's interesting because in the documentary, how they talk about people who grew up in the IBLP with Gothard and how they looked up on the internet, I actually was kind of chuckling because I did that 20 years ago during like the America Online days. So just
wow.
But yeah, so there's that, and then there's one other thing too. You know, you're mentioning like the Christian nationalism. That's something that was definitely sort of pushed. You know, there's a moment where I think they tried to make some sort of connection to Trump and to Mike Huckabee and the Duggar dad like running for office. Like it's what you end up seeing in it, and this is one of the critical things, is it's a lot of really dishonesty and projection from the documentary, because what they try and depict is they try and project Christians are the only ones trying to make some sort of influence in the government to legislate their morality. Wait a minute. What? What do you see like right now? Like Gretchen, whatever the governor of the Michigan. I think her first name is Gretchen. I can't remember her last name. She just passed legislation of like fines of $10,000 or like a year in prison if you don't identify certain people by their pronouns. That's not legislating morality. But all of a sudden, these dangerous Christians are the ones that are going to make you all oppressive. And it's funny because, you know, we did an episode a while back on The Handmaid's Tale, you know, a couple of years ago. And there's one point in the documentary where the gal says that, you know, I looked at Handmaid's Tale is what I identify with my upgrowing in ILBP. But when you look at, if you actually follow Margaret, is it Margaret Atwood?
Yeah.
Margaret Atwood's book, like her book, which I've read, and, you know, some of the show, they depict everything as just like, this is how the Christians are going to destroy society, right, through all this like oppression and stuff. But if you actually look at history, all the sort of dystopian oppressivism of people being oppressed, people being killed, genocide, being thrown in jail, it's all come about by secularism and the state. Like one of the most laughable things, like I love our Canadian friends. I love Stephen Bancars. I miss you. Please come back soon. Right?
Yes. Our shout out, our official shout out to Stephen.
Right? So Canada's a beautiful place. I love our brothers and sisters who are in Canada. But if you think like the show depicts Canada as this wonderful utopia of freedom that's just wonderful, and everyone just flocks to go there. Okay. Right. During 2020 and like in all the restrictions, like Canada was the most like restricted place. Like it has the most restrictions, especially Canada's also the most prejudiced towards Christians and religious freedoms right now. Like I know pastors who like their whole churches were shut down, like the government like wrapped fences around their church in order for them not to be able to worship and practice their right to assembly. So so my point being is that there's so much projection. These Christians are the one who are trying to do this, but we're doing the exact same thing and then some. So I think there's a level, what is frustrating me because like what it did well, which a lot of these documentaries do, they depict the abuse and they call it out. And honestly, like I wish Christians should be we should be the ones doing that, and we're not.
Well, to be fair, you know, there's been OG ministries that have been around forever talking about this stuff. Y'all are one of them.
That's true.
This is like one of those things where ministries and pastors and churches remind me of like the unspoken heroes, like who talks about the lifeguard on Facebook, right? Who probably saved a kid last week in the pool. You know, like we don't hear about that, but these ministries, they were there for me, and nobody knows who they are.
Yeah.
They're undercover in that sense, you know, and they've been around forever calling this stuff out. Don Vino's a great example of this. Don Vino's friends with Ginger Duggar, and he's with Midwest Outreach. Yeah. And he's been doing this longer than I've been alive, you know, and so there's this passion of these Christians that have a sense of justice, that know that this is wrong, that have been calling this out before this documentary was ever even made. And so and they're Christians, and this comes from a Christian worldview of justice. Like, hey, this is a cult. This is abuse. And they said it before anybody else did. So I do kind of want to give a shout out to the OG ministries that have been around forever. I call them trailblazers. And I have to say Coltish is one of them. You guys exist to call this stuff out.
That's the saddest thing too. Like in this documentary, what we see is we see people coming from Gothardism or whatever you want to call it into this like really intense form of progressive leftism. They left one cult for another, and they still don't have Jesus. And as Christians, we need to look at them and we got to say they don't have peace with God, and they're doing everything that they can to try to give peace or have peace in their life. And we know they don't have it, but they need Jesus still. And that's the reality of it. And our heart should break for them as Christians, because I mean, as Christians, we want to be people who deal in the truth, right? So if we're going to make a documentary, if we're going to make anything, we want to at least be intellectually honest with the claims that we're making. So in terms of a documentary, I can just paint like this for an example. If it's going to talk about atheism and a Christian documentary made it, and they're saying that Mao of China was an atheist and he killed upwards to 40 to 80 million people. I can't remember the exact number. And then they say, now these same people are invading our governments, and all atheists and agnostics act the same way and do the same things and believe the same things Mao believes. I mean, it's just dishonest, right? And they would have an uproar. They'd be like, no, there's different types of atheism. There's secular humanism.
Well, and then, I mean, I'm sure both of us, all three of us, have good friends that are atheists, you know?
Right.
We have great conversations with them. We don't agree, but they're not. Yeah, I see what you're saying. They're not. They're broad brushed.
Yeah, it's a broad brush, or it's like saying, okay, well, the transgender shooter who killed children at the Presbyterian Covenant School, you're transgender, you're just like her.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, that's just intellectually dishonest.
I'm so glad you're talking about this. Yes.
I was going to say, if you're in sin, you're in sin, and you need to repent of your transgenderism, and you need to understand that God created you, and you're going to have to deal with the fact that you're going to die one day, and the wages of sin is death. Your very inevitable death in front of you shows you that you're not autonomous. You're not a law to yourself, because the wages of sin is death, and that's the transgression against the law of God. So you need to repent of it, and I care about you, and I want you to know about that so you can actually think correctly. But I'm not going to broad brush you with someone who went and shot up a school because of an ideology, right? Or a twist.
Same with the whole LGBTQ plus movement. I made a post not too long ago about this. I'm like, don't dehumanize them, guys. Like, you know, I mean, there's a level of seeing people in the image of God.
Yeah,
they were created, you know, and known in that way by God. And when you dehumanize, and that's what's done to us sometimes, they don't see us as people. They see it, we're the enemy, and it's not good to be on the other side of that. So why? And these verses about, this is really interesting. I had a friend the other day talking about, you know, loving your enemy. What does that look like? Like, would you pray for your enemy? And Jesus is praying for the people as they're killing him. And I thought to myself, I'm like, I wonder how many people I know right now would be comfortable praying for, you know, the trans activist that's trying to teach their kids about gender spectrum. Would you, you know what I mean? Yeah. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, that's kind of convicting to think about, you know, but that helps with the love aspect. You don't have to affirm somebody to love them. It's a level of what you're saying, Andrew. It's what you're saying. There's intellectual honesty, speaking truth in love, and kind of getting back to that, because I think that there's this measure of people just putting on their gloves, picking up their pitchforks, and, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm perfect at it. I am human too, you know what I mean? And I've done that, but there's a conviction that I want when it comes to this and in this regard. And people are like, oh, you're compromising if you do that. And I just wholeheartedly disagree. What do you guys think?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. We live in this weird reality now where if you say something to someone and it hurts their feelings, all of a sudden they are a victim and you need to atone to them. Yeah. And that's the sad state of the world that we live in. It's this weird mental confusion because we've gone so far from what the Bible teaches in terms of who God is, who is Jesus, how are we saved, what are people, what is the point of even being here, that if you don't agree with what one person just thinks randomly about their existence in their life and you tell them the truth of the gospel, like Paul says it's offensive to people. The gospel is the stench of death, and they will want to hunt you down and hurt you. Like it gets to that point in a society, but sometimes those things happen in order to bring about a reformation. And that's my prayer, is repentance, reconciliation, and reformation in our country, that there's people that are lost, looking at all kinds of other ways to try to get peace with God, including self-mutilation, when God himself was the one who sacrificed his flesh for them so that they could have peace with God. The answer is already there.
It's the offense of the gospel that they should be offended at. We have comment sections, okay? We understand the sins of people and their words, and how kind of just honestly cruel people can be. It's not the best thing, for your mental health sometimes to read a comment section, and sadly that's just the way of it. Yeah. And so whenever we're talking about offense and stuff, and it's what you guys are saying, what you're saying, Andrew, with whenever you speak and whenever you're saying something, the offense should be at the message, not the messenger. There's probably a cliche saying about that, but I can't think of it at the moment. So, Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, man, there's so many thoughts, and there's so many different ways that we could go. And if I'm honest, I feel like there's something I feel sort of led to say, and I feel like almost nervous in a sense, but I think it's appropriate. Is one of the challenges, and again, my vantage point is listening. What was the Duggar that was in the documentary?
Jill Duggar.
So in it, you have her and her husband, and I believe she's expecting. In the documentary, they're expecting a child. I don't know if it's like their second or how many children they have. And again, my vantage point is very, I have very like limited vantage point. I don't know the nature of the relationship between Ginger and Jill, for example. Like I said, both you and I have talked with Ginger, on our own podcast, and I only watched Jill by way of this documentary. I did notice a distinct difference between the two, where there was a distinction between how Ginger would portray the Duggar parents versus how Jill would. And I mean that I want to say this also just in the most compassionate way possible, given there's a lot of very difficult, very traumatic things. So I'm not saying this lightly. There's a difference, I think, between how Ginger has talked about her parents, how they had the best of intentions, and even with the difficulties that she faced. And I could even see in Ginger's, face, like when she talked to me, there's a couple moments, where behind all the makeup and stuff behind, when she's talking to us, I could see the emotion like in her eyes. You may have seen that yourself. She went through some like very difficult like disentangling, and she found freedom. Nothing worthwhile comes without a fight, without a cost. There's a difference though, and from my perspective, of how Jill talked about her father and her parents. A lot of, I don't even know if like disdain or just animosity is even the appropriate word. There is like unresolved tension, if that makes sense. And the only thing it did, I just sensed that, and it kind of made me sad. And again, I have my own past. Like I grew up sort of in that fundy world, not exactly Bill Gothard. My parents weren't perfect. I feel like I've gone a different route where I probably would identify a lot with why I think the book with Ginger really identified with me, because I've had to do my own disentangling, like a lot of it. I've had plenty of times in my life where I should have deconstructed. Like, I look at the stories of people who've deconstructed, and I see it every single time, and I see their stories, and I'm like, that should be me. Like, there's no reason why I shouldn't be a Josh Harris, or why I shouldn't be like a Derek Webb, or who are those two influencers who do all the trick? The guys, the two YouTube guys who do all the jokes, the two former Christians they deconstructed.
Oh, Rhett and something.
Yeah, Rhett and they're hilarious, but they deconstructed too. And it's like, I think I resonated with, what John Cooper said at the Dove Awards. He was emotional about the people who have like left their wives and deconstructed and like walked away, and part of it might have to do, I'm married, I've got I have a son on the way, and like in November, like in my son is going to see and observe me, like who I am, like in privately, and and it's like part of me just is worried in a sense for Jill. And again, my vantage point's limited, and she may see this, she might not. I don't know, but honestly, it's like, well, do you want the children to repeat the sins of the father? Well, here you are on a public platforming, in some sense, talking bad about your parents and all the things that they did wrong. But here you are on a documentary. You're putting your statement down on public record. The one day your children are going to see. You're going to take the best that you know to try and train them, and it may not work out for them. And who knows how this is going to affect them. And and it's just one of those things that I think that when it comes to this sorts of like family reconciliation, I think many times, sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you have relationships that are not mendable. But I think in a sense, if at all possible, there's a scripture that, really comes to mind. It's in Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. And it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers." And so it's like a two-way street. And I think some of the ways that has helped me, like in what I've had to work through, and so much of what resonated with Ginger and her like my own disentanglement, like was that. So in the ways that my dad was really great as a father, like I'll honor him and commend them for that. And I will state those things publicly. In the ways in which, my father failed as a patriarch and as a leader, like I have given that to the Lord, but I also will honor him by not repeating his sins.
I think, I can see why you would be hesitant to share that opinion. And I think you did a good job of sharing why you would be hesitant about that, but also sharing your thoughts on that. Yeah. And, I think slightly what I would think of with her, maybe that might be a little different, is in a way, there's probably things that she didn't say as well. For sure. So when I think of cults, when I think of this, one of the hardest things that victims do or don't do is speak up. All right. So in this regard, I liked this documentary. Yeah. In this regard, I thought it was good. I thought that there were people speaking up and talking about things that they were not allowed to talk about. And so for her, that might have been a example to their kids to do the right thing, even if it is family. Yeah. So, it might be a perspective on that regard. And Jim Bob, oh my word, I know what you mean though, because thinking about the parents and how they're doing damage control and all these things, I hope that in particular their dad doesn't double down. You know what I mean? But we don't know what he does behind closed doors. We don't know if there's something where maybe there's been repentance. But in a way, I almost, I don't blame her, but even watching her, there were times where she's like, I don't want to speak about that, especially about her brother. Yeah. That was harmful, it was hurtful for her. And so there might be some courage that she had to soup up, if you will, to talk, to even begin to talk about it on a level where maybe that was healing for her. But I definitely see what you're saying.
Just real quickly, just one last thing, and in fairness too, when you think about documentary, you go down there and you'll have an interview. You'll talk for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours, and
they take like 15 minutes of it.
15 minutes and maybe like 5 minutes of it. Like Sandra Tanner. So Sandra Tanner, who's been who was retired, a part of. She was on the Netflix documentary Murder Among the Mormons. Like they interviewed her for 6 or 7 hours, and then they ended up changing the direction of the documentary very last minute, and she was only in the documentary for like 15 minutes. So sometimes, so sometimes honestly, you don't have control. And again, I do admire her and also anyone else like for their courage to stand for it. It just, I don't know.
Found that she didn't like bash either. I thought that was on her part. I thought that was really good. Yeah. Ginger though, I see what you're saying though with the difference. Yeah. I think Ginger, there's a Christ-like way that she kind of went about that. I can't say either were wrong in that, you know what I mean? But there, I know what you're saying. Yeah, like there was something about Ginger's countenance with the whole thing where there was a level of forgiveness and love, and the way that she handled. There's so much respect, guys. Really get her book. There is something very humbling about reading Ginger's book, considering what she's been through and how she got to where she's at, and the way that she honored just herself, her family, in a loving, but also in a way where she called out the principles of IBLP. Yeah. It was humbling. That's the word I'll use. Andrew, you were going to say something. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's wise to remember, and I don't think the documentary did this with Jim, the father, is that if he is also a follower of Gothard's teachings and their false teachings, then he's a victim too, right? If he's following something that he thinks is right and he's doing it according to the lens that through Gothard, then he's also has fallen prey to false teaching, right? So we need to pray for him as well. That's the reality of the situation, because he may believe sincerely that he's doing the right thing, right? But he could be sincerely wrong because he's been deceived by a false prophet. I speak to people like that every single Thursday when I go out to Provo and I do Mormon evangelism. They're very sincere in their beliefs, but they're sincerely wrong. Why? Because they're a victim to a false prophet. So the documentary doesn't have the ability, being made by secular people, to have an objective point of view in the situation. Instead, it says, well, Jim Bob now created his own cult because the patriarchy is bad. So now we have Gothard's bad, Jim is bad, but what they're failing to understand is that he's a victim as well. Does that make sense? And there's things that he didn't do right, of course. Don't say, I'm not saying that he's a knight in shining armor or anything like that. He did things that are wrong that I think that should not have been done. But what I'm saying is there's something that guided his life, and that was false teaching, and that hurts. That hurts, you know?
Yes. Yeah, I know, and there's a level of responsibility he does need to take, of course, and I don't think anybody's saying that he shouldn't, but yeah, you say that like you do a cultish podcast or something, you know, like you say that like you like you talk to a lot of cult members, and yes, I have a hearty amen to that. That is a very very wise way of looking at it, because that's how I look at Jehovah's Witnesses, right? I mean, this is how we approach, you know, Mormons, LDS, whatever it is that you separate them, you in a way, again, humanizing. It's like you separate them from the ideology, and all of a sudden you see this person that's hurt and holding on to whatever this is for a reason. And I talk to my girls a lot about taking responsibility, right? And I tell them this all the time, where you're allowed your feelings, you're allowed to feel a certain way, and those are all allowed, but your behaviors, not all behaviors are welcome in that way.
Yeah.
You got to take responsibility. And there's a point of no return where if your sister is bugging you and doing something to provoke you, you're not at fault until you react, and all of a sudden you're a part of this mess, you know. And it's like, it kind of reminds me of that as I was watching this, and it kind of ties into what you're saying with him kind of coming under that that cult like mentality. And we would think the same thing and say the same thing about anybody that's in a cult, which is why we do what we do and talk about these things. And why ministries have existed for decades, Christian ministries that believe in the Bible, believe in moral law, that appeal to a higher law in that sense, and say this is wrong, and have been saying that for years. So, yeah, Jerry, is there anything you want to add?
No, it's good. I think, like I said, the existence of the takeaway ultimately, you know, when it comes to like how do you deal with a movement like Gothard, because there's gonna be more. Like, I don't know however God has called, you know, us to do our thing and you to do your thing. Like, there's gonna be similar movements. Like, there's, you know, whatever happens in 2024. I mean, I know that politically it's going to be a dumpster fire. That's the only thing I'm really looking forward to. I mean, maybe the memes, there'll be some good memes, but aside from that, like, there's no really resolution outside of repentance right now. Like, for us to get on our feet and just repent. But honestly, but culturally, times of uncertainty are going to create a lot of turmoil. Like times of turmoil create a lot of uncertainty. But that creates vacuums for people to fill in the void. So you had a lack of father rule, appropriate patriarchal rule, of father rule, of looking over their households, and they look to someone for authority. But again, it trickles down. So in the same way, fathers were looking to Bill Gothard for authority, but they realized ultimately there's no check balances and powers with Gothard. It was always rules for thee and not for me. So I think honestly, like the culture of abuse within that was that fathers were the final say without authority, because Bill Gothard can not really have any authority and not really give all this advice without having experience. I can sort of do the same thing too. And then you have that like trickle down. That's why you need to lead by example. You need to be example and practice what you preach. And, like I said, I think that, with like the failure of the deconstruction of progressivism, you're destroying everything. How do you restore the authentic when you've deconstructed and dismantled everything? You're going to pendulum swing to the exact opposite side. And honestly, 20 years from now, we're going to hear stories of horrific abuse just as bad, if not worse, than what we see in the IBLP on the progressive side. And we're going to have to deal with that and pick up the pieces. And so hopefully, whether it's us or somebody who kind of follows in our footsteps or your footsteps, Melissa, however long you do this, they'll be able to help pick up the pieces of, the people who pendulum swing to the other side. So I think like I said, there's a document like this. There's a lot to learn from it. And hopefully we will learn from it, and at least do what we can, including having conversations like this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm really glad at the end they showed Ginger's book as well. And they kind of showed a few snippets of her talking about her experience. So that was good. And we've been talking a long time about this. We could probably make this a whole other second episode talking about this, because there was 4 episodes, There was a lot to talk about. But yeah, I want to know everybody's thoughts, though, that's watching. If there's something we missed, if you agree, if you disagree, let us know in the comment section. Maybe we might do another episode of this. Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, is there anything you guys want to add or talk about? Maybe something that you had on a note somewhere that you wanted to discuss before we sign off?
I feel like we've covered most of the bases. I mean, there's a lot of layers to it. I think learning that I'm learning about what it means to be a husband and what it means to, shepherd my wife. Like I said, I take a complementarian view, and my wife and I watched the documentary together, and we had some great conversations about, okay, well, this isn't a distortion of that. Like, what does our marriage look like? And I think, in that documentary, we were able to have some great conversations about, okay, well, how do we not do something like this? How do we have a marriage that actually resembles Christ, where I'm leading her and she's submitting, but in a way that's like biblical, but not the Gothard version, and there's
a difference.
There's all the stuff we're all like trying. Like, I'm new and I'm trying to figure this all out, and I think that's one thing that you look at this documentary, you're like, well, I don't want that. Like,
nobody wants that.
I've got a boy on the way, and I don't want him to one day, 20 years from now, to be in a documentary sitting in that chair, God forbid. Honestly, that's something that came across my mind, and I need to think about what that means as far as like how I how I'm the spiritual leader of my household, and like how I train my kids.
You are the example of why society needs good men and good husbands. Like everything you're saying.
Thank you.
Like, as a female, seriously, I tell my husband this often, that I'm just so happy there are differences between us. And the big, strong man. I mean, come on. There's a level of leadership that is admirable. And that, everything you're saying, imagine for a second that, say the father of somebody in IBLP is repeating what you're saying. Like, wow, I have some thinking to do. I should probably sit back and kind of consider what submission is and how this is hurting my family, which is hard to do in a cult, because which, by the way, I'll leave a link to Stephen Hassan's book in the description. I need everybody, I think it's a great book to read about this, about the bite model and stuff. But think about what you're saying, and anybody that's watching that maybe has an issue with the patriarchy. Maybe they don't like men. Maybe there's an element where, you know, everything that they're saying in the documentary as far as control and men are bad or whatever it is. Think about what Jerry's saying, if you could, just for a second, and think if your father said that. Like how different that would be. This is the point, that there's a humility there, a Christ-like humility with what the Bible teaches about a husband shepherding his wife. People would hear that with traumatic ears and think something totally different than what you just said. And so I think that's the part of healing that people need to hear, is that there's a very beautiful way to look at this, where Jerry, you're looking at, and I could see it in this interview, the way that you are taking this so seriously, where you're like, wow, I thought I knew things, you know, and then I got married and now there's a baby on the way. Oh my word. There's things that I need to look within on myself. And you are exactly, and I think it was, I don't know, somebody really smart, like Jordan Peterson or something about the society. Maybe it was even Frank. It was Frank Turk, my friend, talking about the societal need. Funny how I think Jordan Peterson and Frank.
Jordan Peterson would be like, anyway. Society is like a lobster. Society is like a lobster. Something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But anyways, he's talking about why, like the structure of society needs good men and why. And he was coming at it from like a logical perspective, like from a fact-based, logical, philosophical perspective. And it was so sound. And I think you're exemplifying that right now, like why we need that. And so I think that what you're doing, you're on the right path with that, and you're prayerfully considering these things. So, but yeah, no, I want to thank you guys both for coming on. I love it when we go over an hour, because I could easily be here for another hour talking about this, especially with my Coltish guys.
Yeah.
Again, everybody, please check out the description. Coltish, go subscribe to their YouTube channel for more content, more material, everything that we talked about that I think is relevant to this conversation as far as resources, books, videos, whatever, will be in the description as well. Thank you guys so much for coming on and talking with me today.
Absolutely. Can't wait for next time.
Yeah, it was fun.